All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to our guests who are online. And we want to say thank you to the Center for Dialogue for letting us have our wonderful meeting here tonight. Beautiful autumn evening. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples. And that I, as Dean of the Faculty of Environment, Naomi Krogman, want to just say one of my strongest hopes is to deepen our connection with the First Peoples of this region and also learn from the wisdom of other Indigenous peoples. Tonight is part of that effort. So welcome to the first of the Dean's Lecture Series. Environmental issues are among some of the most pressing challenges we face globally, and there is a need for knowledge sharing about how to create change. The traditional environmental calls to action are to reduce, reuse, and recycle, but this series is reframing the call to a new set of R's that are essential to creating a more sustainable world. They are reconciliation, resilience, and regeneration. Sxwpilemaát Siyám, or Chief Leanne Joe, and Lily Raphael will address the first R in this talk about economic reconciliation. They will also introduce themselves in their presentation. Before we jump into the presentation, I am pleased to introduce to you Sxwpilemaát, or Chris Lewis, who is Director of Indigenous Initiatives and Reconciliation at Simon Fraser University. He is a member of the Squamish Nation, and he will welcome us with a song. Chris.
Sxwpilemaát Siyám, Sxwpilemaát Sxwpilemaát Kakakanak Siyám, Yo and Hath and Squelwin Siyám, Nath Ta'an Sitachtin Pushaman, Chris Lewis, Queen Sna, on Winop Squelwin. Just opening in the one of the languages of this land, the Squamish language, saying it's great to see each and every one of you, respected leaders, guests, relatives, and acquaintances. As was mentioned, my ancestral name is Sitachtin. Honored to be here today with you. My heart, it feels good to be in this room with all of you. On behalf of our relatives, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and our home community, the Squamish, we welcome you to our shared territory. This place that we are, which is now known as WAS Center or downtown Vancouver, the closest place name I can come with is over near the convention center. It was called Pecals. It was a nice white rock sandy beach, which was a navigation point. It's funny that there's white sails there now, but if you're on the SkyTrain, you can see some of the white rocks as you go through the tunnel up to Granville Street Station. And so that testament is that we're still here. And the place of Vancouver we know is come alive. Can everyone say come alive? Which means the place of giant maple trees. And now we have giant cement and steel trees that kind of reference this land. The reason I say this and I get you to say a few of the words is that we want to reconcile ourselves with what was here, because in our teachings, a lot of these things are still here. In the spirit of those things that were here, and the stories and mythology that is here, that has reminded us as Indigenous peoples of this land, how to conduct ourselves as human beings on this place. So I'm grateful to be here once again with all of you, and thank you for honoring the invitation for one of our Siyams to present on economic reconciliation. I would be remiss, especially with the week and the big week and the big day on Friday, carrying my drum all week, and I'm going to sing a song This is Sxwpilemaát's song. It's a greeting song. It starts very fast. It's just to kind of rattle everybody a little bit, and then the beat will slow down and then pick up. It's really just to get us all in the same rhythm before we start the evening. It's a welcome song from one of our Slanai, our matriarch Sxwpilemaát, who lived at what we know as Kwai, or now Lumberman's Arch in Stanley Park. So the song comes from a very close place here, and I'll sing that, and then I'll pass it over to our Siyám for the excellent presentation. And again, once again, thank you all, and thank you for honoring us with your presence. Being here with us in person and online is medicine for all of us. Siyám, thank you.
I'm just going to invite Chief Leanne and Lily Raphael to take off with the presentation now.
Awesome. Good evening, everybody. How is everybody this evening? Fantastic. Just want to thank Ardeen, Naomi, for the invitation to begin this year's Dean's Lecture and presenting on our work, Step into the River, an Economic Reconciliation Framework. I also like to acknowledge my dear cousin, Christopher, for the welcome, for the song. This is very integral because I'm presenting to you. We're going to talk about this in a little bit as we move through the presentation. I'm going to talk about life as ceremony and the importance of that space. So traditionally, and the reason I say that I'm not doing the welcome to the territory, I have asked my cousin to do the welcome on my behalf, because again, this would be a traditional way of doing things in ceremony. Also, back in the day, I would be in my homelands, where my name comes from, which is Gibson's Landing. It's the English name today. You would be coming on canoes to the shores of where my family would be, the place and space and the land where we would live. And as you were coming to the shore on your canoes, you would need to share, before I welcomed you to the lands, your intentionality of why were you coming to visit, and then there would be a whole thing to the welcoming, to the greeting, to that sharing. Then you would come ashore, and then we would feast, right? And so there's a huge significance. Don't take lightly the space that has been created, the foundation of which Christopher has laid for us to be here this evening. One, speaking in the language, inviting the ancestors to be with us, bringing the heartbeat of the drum with us this evening, so that we in this space will travel this journey together in that same heartbeat. And I share this because it's very intentional for the space that we're trying to create through this framework around what in English terms would be economic reconciliation, and what the potential of a future state for us. So that's a long-winded welcome to our presentation. I'm gonna jump right in. My name is Sxwpilemaát Siyám, also known as Chief Leanne Joe. I am one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation. I am the first female chief of my family. I share the name with my late father, Sxwpilemaát Siyám. If you notice, he is Sxwpilem, I'm Sxwpilemaát. The "at" at the end of my name feminizes it. It tells you that a woman is carrying that name. It is only synonymous with one who carries the responsibility of being the head of the family. That is the Siyam at the end of my name. That tells you the role or responsibility that I carry within my family, and that is being the head of that family, being responsible for my whole entire family. In settler language, in the English language, you would use chief to delineate that space. I come from the Leanne Joe family. I am, like I said, the hereditary chief of the Leanne Joe family of the Squamish people. Like I said, my ancestors came from the Gibsons area, but I was born and raised in Oslahan, the beautiful waters across the shore here. So in North Vancouver and West Vancouver area. I am also closely tied to the Thomas family of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, our sister nation in the Burrard Inlet. And as well as on my mother's side, I come from the Wilson and Frank families of the Coast Salish dialect of the Kwakwaka'wakw speaking people on the east coast shores of Vancouver Island. What you know today as Courtenay, Comox, Campbell River areas, which makes me a true blue West Coast Indian. I'm literally related to everybody on the West Coast. This is my cousin Shelly Joe right in front of you. It's my sister. I brought her here for moral support because we travel in packs, right? Generally, we don't go alone anywhere. But this just again shows you and the reason I introduce myself in this way and is to show you my kinship ties, because this is how we introduce ourselves in the community, so that we lay the groundwork of the foundation of understanding our relationship, not only to each other, but to the places and from where we come from. And again, the accountability and the responsibility to those places, to that land, to those resources. And I am also married into the Inkakatlam, Shuswap, and Syilx speaking people. My husband is from Upper Nicola Band. He is a Syilx and Inkakatlam man. He is literally related to everybody in southern British Columbia. So he had to come to the coast to find his wife that he wasn't related to, and me the same. I had to go to the Okanagan. And and I share that also because I now, being married into those communities, I now share that responsibility of to those nations and the territories in which we are raising our son. I have a beautiful, amazing 15-year-old teenage boy. He is privileged. He carries 3 ancestral names, Shkunuk, Skoksi, and Matlidas. Shelly Joe's dad privileged us and our family, and my son in particular, with a name from their family. And so this sharing is, you understand the depth of responsibility of and accountability to all of this space, to those lands, to the people, and to all of our ancestors, and in particular for the people yet to be, right? Can you flip it? Sorry, I keep forgetting Lori has to flip our slide. So yeah, this is what I just spoke to. So recognizing and acknowledging both past, present, and the future. And this work is embedded in this knowing, and this knowing isn't here. It's in my heart. It's in my DNA. I was born into responsibility and into being of service to my people. And I'm going to pass it finally over to Lily to introduce who co-authored this document with me.
Thanks, Leanne. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for welcoming us to these territories. And thank you so much to Ginger and Chris and Marissa for being respondents here tonight for us for this framework. Thank you so much to SFU and to all of you for joining us this evening. My name is Lily Raphael, and I am originally, I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is Shawnee and Miami and Hopewell territory. My ancestry on my mother's side is German and Irish, 3rd and 4th generation German and Irish immigrants to the east coast of the US, to Lenape and Wampanoag territories. And on my father's side, we are Black Louisiana Creole from New Orleans, so Choctaw territories. And Creole has a lot of different identities kind of wrapped up into it. So we're Black, Afro-Caribbean, French, Italian, Spanish, a lot of different ones that I probably don't know also. Yeah, I've been grateful to be here on these lands since 2017, and really grateful to Sxwpilemaát Siyám, Chief Leanne, for her friendship and all of her teachings, and for getting to grow and learn and work alongside her over the past few years as we've worked to convene different people and develop this framework. I'm coming to you today kind of with all of my complexities of my identity as a person who is mixed, as a person who is a descendant of stolen peoples who were enslaved in the South of the United States, as a person who has the privilege to be able to migrate to different countries and between countries and call many places my home. So I'm here with all of my complexities and really grateful to spend this evening with all of you. And yeah, I think I'll pass it over to you, or should I keep going?
Yeah,
We're just gonna
let's jump right in. We need to go to
All
the
right.
next slide, Lori.
Sounds good. So we just wanted to continue our thank yous for all of those who were involved in making this work happen. So the many participants listed here on this slide are all the partners who came to our convenings when we first started this work. And we are also really grateful to SFU Strategic Initiatives Priority Project and Van City Community Investment, our funding partners. Thank you to all the thought leaders who participated in our engagement sessions, as well as Nahaney Creative for your design work on the framework, on the document itself. Thank you so much, especially to the Faculty of Environment for your institutional and administrative support. And thank you so much to our communications team and to the SFU CED team within the faculty. And thank you as well. A huge thank you to Jeremy Stone, who did so much to make this work happen and was a pivotal kind of conceiver of the idea to apply for funding and to ensure that there was ongoing support for the project and for just always providing guidance for this work as it developed. And
Awesome.
yeah, I'm just really thankful for Jeremy for that. I think we can go to the next slide. I'll pass it over to Leanne.
So we're going to bounce back because this is a co-creation. This document is beautiful because it is complex, because it was a labor of love. It happened both pre-pandemic, pandemic, and is now continuing post-pandemic. And a lot happened, not just the pandemic. We went through many spaces of, stuff that was happening with the Mi'kmaq back east at the time. We were dealing with Black Lives Matter in North America. There was just so many complex spaces that we held as women, as an Indigenous woman, as a mother, as a person of color and a woman of color, and just all of the complexities that life was throwing at us, whilst we were trying to really land on what this work needed to be. And most importantly, what it was again for us here, because this isn't work that has to be done up here. If you're not, a beautiful quote that I heard by one of the SFU BD schools, EMBA, IBL students during one of our first classes, an elder shared with her is the longest journey for most people is the length of a feather. And if you put your feather at your heart, it's the journey is from here to here. And that's the longest journey that we can have as human beings. And that struck me as a beautiful metaphor for the effort and commitment and action required to do this work in a very meaningful, but also healing in a beautiful way. And again, can we move? No, let's actually stay here. Sorry. So life is ceremony. Again, like I really touched on that earlier about what this means. One of the metaphors that I tried to encapsulate, that we tried to encapsulate at the beginning of this work was, what is the metaphor for that? Like physically, for me, it would be, for us as coastal people, would be the big house. All of what we do happens in the big house. We live there, we practice governance there, our economy is there, our knowledge is transferred there. Like literally our whole way of being is and doing is attached to where those places are, right? And then the sustenance and the resources that come with that, and being on the shores of the water, everything like that. And so we have created a space for you to be mindful of what this means for Indigenous people when you're doing economic reconciliation work. You have to be curious about, what does this mean for them? Because what I'm sharing with you is not going to be the same for them, right? British Columbia has 204 First Nation communities under the Indian Act. There are over 630 plus First Nations communities across the country. BC alone has 32 plus major family dialects in the province, which means there are further dialects to those big family linguistic spaces. And all of those are based in place in different lands and geography of the province. And then their culture and their language is tied to those places, which means their ceremony is going to be unique to them, right? And to those places and to those spaces, and the influence of all of those things that embodies their way of being and doing. So again, this is just to be mindful, all right? And hold this in your heart, that when we move through place, this is how we do it as Indigenous peoples. Every space, every decision, when I'm walking, both heavily or lightly, when I'm communicating with my son, my husband, my community, my family, nations, to you, to others, I am consistently coming from this place because this is in my DNA. This is who I am. This is what I live and breathe. This is my counsel, my guidance. So again, my call to action is that you be mindful of what this is and be curious about what it is when you go back into community and are working with this Indigenous people, whether they're urban, whether they're rural, whether they're remote, doesn't matter. You are mindful when you go into those spaces that you're respecting and acknowledging what this might mean for them and how they want to be in relationship with you. That's very important. So your role in ceremony is going to be to deepen your understanding and again, be super respectful to the curiosity of what this can mean as a starting point. So Lori, can we? One more, sorry. Okay, we'll pass it over to Lily again.
All right. So actually, could we go back to the last slide and we can just do a quick, I'm feeling the need to kind of just take some breaths with people in the room. So if we go back to, yeah, great. So before we continue, something that I like to do with groups is just take a moment to kind of breathe together and just drop into our bodies. It's a way of, for me at least, reminding myself when doing work like this that's aimed at being very transformative and kind of future, like leading us into the future, we need to bring our bodies along with us. And so I'd like to invite just a quick exercise just to ground us as we go forward for this evening. So you can just sit up in your seat nice and tall and plant both feet on the floor. And you're welcome to close your eyes or focus your gaze softly in front of you if that's more comfortable. And just take a moment to notice yourself and feel the ground beneath your feet and the chair supporting you. If there's any point where this is uncomfortable, please feel free to stop. Otherwise, I would invite you to place your hands either on your belly or your heart, wherever it feels most comfortable for you. And we'll take 3 breaths together. So we'll inhale, filling up the belly and the heart. And exhale. Again, inhaling. And exhale. And one last inhale. Feeling the air fill up in your body. And exhale. And whenever you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes or shift your gaze and come back into the space. Thank you. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, where I'll just share that in this session, we'll be sharing about our process, as well as offering some reflections and dialogue on the current state. So what we've heard from participants in our convenings that we held, and consider what's needed to shift to a desired future state. We'll also share an overview of the framework and how some opportunities for how to interact with it and invitations for next steps. And then we'll have a Q&A after that. So next slide, please. So in our work, we were guided by this question of what if economic reconciliation were a means of transforming our collective economy from the current state to a desired future state? So this framework offers a set of values and mind shifts and practices to support how practitioners, local governments, organizations, and institutions can engage in reconciliation and engage in this question and consider how we might meet another desired outcome beyond our current state. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So okay, so our process. Getting used to your system of
Right.
typing things. It's funny doing this in person after doing it online for so long. So just to share a bit about our process, it consisted of a series of convenings and generative dialogues with Indigenous thought leaders and practitioners, as well as non-Indigenous individuals who represented Indigenous-led organizations and governments across BC. Stemming from the commitment to right historical wrongs of colonialism and centering Indigenous ways of being and Indigenous economies. This work has been based on engagement with Indigenous leadership in the economic development sector. And based on our conversations with those who came to the convening, we envision a future economy that's centered in well-being and rooted in Indigenous values and knowledge. Our process definitely included a lot of listening, dialogue, cultivating friendships, and really committing to storytelling and truth-telling, and being present to that. And so the next part of this presentation will be sharing a few of the quotes from convenings just to share what their experience has been in reconciliation or in engaging in economic reconciliation thus far. And that was a kind of an indicator of and a message of kind of what might need to be shifting for us as we go forward. So next slide. And the next one. And I'll just read a quote quickly from Paulette Reagan, Unsettling the Settler Within, that also helps to ground this part of the work in terms of what we need to, of how we need to center truth-telling. So settler violence against Indigenous peoples is woven into the fabric of Canadian history in an unbroken thread from past to present that we must now unravel, unsettling our comfortable assumptions about the past. At the same time, we must work as Indigenous allies to restory the dominant culture version of history. That is, we must make decolonizing space for Indigenous history, counter narratives of diplomacy, law, and peacemaking practices as told by Indigenous peoples themselves. Next slide, please. I think so. Yeah. So reconciliation has become the sprinkles on the cupcake. The foundational components of the cupcake are not changing. Next slide, please. There's a lack of realization of implicit bias amongst non-Indigenous people. They feel good about themselves for engaging, but they do not go beyond that. Non-Indigenous organizations are protective over economic opportunity. They do not see our involvement as a growth opportunity, but rather as us stealing business. Reconciliation is a journey from the current state to a desired state. It is impossible to build a singular conceptual framework. It's about building wellness in an ecosystem. Our own healing is also intensely integral in this journey from the personal level, growing exponentially to ripple throughout our communities from family to family. Did you want to chime in on any of those
I just want to share, don't take those quotes lightly. They're very impactful. Again, if you're coming from a place of feeling what is being shared, right? If you're really thinking about even the quote around reconciliation being the sprinkles on the cupcakes. We have communities in this region, we have communities nationally, that don't even know about Indigenous people, don't recognize Indigenous people in their space, don't even understand what a land acknowledgement is, let alone do a land acknowledgement or the importance or significance of even just doing that one simple thing. And we have heard in the process of dialoguing with these individuals, that immense space of the fact that media and that we're still in a space of reconciliation where we aren't in like what we would consider as Indigenous people, meaningful engagement, having a seat at every single table, full equity, equality and inclusion in the economic space, let alone transform that space. Right. So again, that's really opened our eyes to the fact that we have only taken one tiny little baby step and in what is true economic reconciliation in this country. So, which then led us to the space of how do we reimagine what wealth is. Right? And the notion of what wealth is. If we look at our economic system, because we ask, I love being curious in space. I love questioning. We will claim we are not providing any direct solution for you. Right? We're here to hold space of curiosity of the possibility if we actually worked towards meaningful economic reconciliation and true engagement, that we together in allyship, in true relationship, can come up with a future state that includes what real wealth could mean for us. So we ask this question, what if our economy centered well-being and flourishing of all living things? Everything, even the things that you don't even know exist in this world, that is not in your purview of knowledge. What have you held in your heart that you are fully responsible for their well-being? And moved away from a dependency and extraction as a basis of our economic structures. So again, this is looking at a future state of what's possible. Could we transform our space of how we see wealth? Because if you look to an Indigenous community, doesn't matter which one it is in this province or any other province in this country or any Indigenous peoples across the globe, their wealth is very different. It is non-linear, it is whole, and it includes a very complex system of knowing and a way of being. Right. So again, if I'm thinking of wealth, my wealth is not determined by the amount of money you have in your bank account and how much money I have in mine. My wealth is my relationship, right? The bond that I have with my family, my relationship and accountability and responsibility and reciprocity that I have not only with them, but all of the resources of thriving that comes from place, space, land in my communities. It also comes from teachings. It comes from being in the big house. It comes from walking on the land. It comes from the teachings of the ancestors. It comes from thinking about my great, 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 great grandchildren's future. All of those things are wealth and well-being for me. Because when our children are thriving, I know that we are doing a good job in creating the wealth that they need. So again, if you're really thinking about what is wealth and can we reimagine what that means for us, the possibility of transformation is at our fingertips, right? Am I missing anything in that one?
I don't think so.
Right.
Oh, here.
Okay, so again, I'm a big fan of quotes. Dr. Dara Kelly and from SFU BD School of Business co-authored this with Mark Podlasley out of First Nations Major Projects Coalition. It's out of their Centering First Nations Concepts of Wellbeing toward a GDP Alternative Index of British Columbia. And again, really summarizes that Indigenous peoples in BC already have a sophisticated concept of what constitutes a good life, meaning their well-being, and a way of living that has been refined over millennia and that varies with each culture, place, and language. This is a significant piece within each culture, place, and language. There's no pan-Indigenous solution to reconciliation or any kind of economic reconciliation. It is based in these things. And I'll touch on the notion of how do we move from a very colonial way of seeing an economic system, and how do we use two-eyed seeing and the approaches and valuing Indigenous knowledge and ways of being and doing to transform our economic model to a well-being model that actually services every single thing. Not just our own, not just our bottom line, not just our GDP, but the well-being of all things for many generations to come. You want to take this one?
Yeah, so this is just another question that guided our thinking, was what happens when our approach to creating, managing, and distributing wealth intentionally centers children and families. And this
Next slide, please.
yeah, next slide, please. Led to this kind of visualization of the community wealth ripple, which I feel like Leanne, you probably
Yeah.
explain this one.
So again, if we're taking all of what I said and we're actually placing children and families at the center of the well-being, if they were a reflection of our own well-being, what would that look like today? What would it look like tomorrow if we just shifted our mindset to this knowing and to valuing them at the center of everything we do towards a well-being economy, which then influences how we create our wealth, then influences all of that, then influences how we manage that wealth. And again, I'm not just talking about financial wealth, right? This is a holistic place of understanding and valuing what wealth is. And then in particular, what does wealth distribution look like and how would it be different, right? Not that this couldn't be used in our economic models today, it totally can, but I'm in a constant place of if good is good enough is better possible, right? In a constant thinking of moving into new spaces. And I think it's a beautiful representation. It is not as holistic as I want it to be. It's still a bit linear because it doesn't show you the complexities and layers that are going to come with doing this work and the challenges. But it allows you and creates the space of again, really shifting about how you see yourselves in a future state. Am I missing anything? Okay.
So, so as we kind of went through this process of the convenings and heard what the current experiences are around reconciliation, and took this time to read or to imagine through these different possibilities of what a different type of wealth could look like, or already does look like, for Indigenous peoples as well. This led to the development of our framework, Step into the River.
And
Next
the
slide.
step into the river, I mean, is a beautiful metaphor. So if you were really listening to origin stories or stories within Indigenous communities, there's a lot of metaphors, right? And I am a fan of one, storytelling, two, metaphors, but also how did we connect and how did we continue to ground this work in a metaphorical space that everybody could understand, right? And then thus we actually went on a beautiful afternoon of determining what this could be, and landed on a place of actually stepping into a river, because literally any of us in this country can step into a river. We are not that far from that physical space and what that represents. And so that is our metaphorical depiction for you to remind your heart in centering this work.
Mhm. Yeah, and if I could just add to that, a reason for the river as opposed to something that's more fixed is because rivers are in constant change, and something that was a really strong learning from our convenings was that there is no one singular way to do reconciliation. There's no singular outcome or path. And so what it means to be doing reconciliation is to be in practice and actually reckoning with everything that has come up from the past, and to stay in that river and follow its course into wherever it might lead us next. So yeah, to be in the river is basically to be in right relationship with change.
Awesome.
And we can go to the next two. Oh yeah, so this is another thing that we heard through our convenings, is our goals are not that different. And that was also a grounding point for thinking through this framework. You can go to the next slide, please. This is a visualization of the framework and the different components of it. So the riverbed down here is the values that can guide economic reconciliation. And then we have our stepping stones. So the kind of fundamental practices of economic reconciliation that if you imagine yourself in this river standing in these different stones, you're constantly in these ongoing practices of self-reflection and awareness, questioning and unlearning, relationship building, and deep listening. And another core part of this is creating ripples. So that's ideas for actions in different sectors related to economic reconciliation. So from whatever point you are, whatever context you're in, there's something that you can be doing, and it's engaging and coming in and reckoning with what it is what that is. Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to add?
This is a huge section of the document, by the way.
Very long. We're doing our best to summarize it here.
Next slide,
Yeah, next slide. What we thought we'd do is just go through the one previously, was go through a few of the values and just provide a bit more detail about what they are and what they might look like in practice. Do you want to speak to rematriation?
Yeah, and this is near and dear to my heart. One, because the place I'm constantly coming from is my most important role in my life, and the biggest legacy I'm going to leave is being a mother. And I'm a woman. I'm an auntie. I'm going to be a grandmother. I'm a daughter. I hold a space of being a matriarch within the community. I also happen to be the head of my family, who is a woman. And so rematriation really came up as a huge value space, not only for myself in doing this work, but by the many Indigenous women that those thought leaders that came to our convenings and spoke to what this would look like, and why the importance of valuing Indigenous women in every single space. Because at the end of the day, they are the true leaders of the communities. They are the ones that are bringing life into the community. They are constantly holding up space for the community in every aspect. And they don't do it alone. They do it alongside the men in the community. And they do it in right relationship together and hold that space consistently. And that has been lost. That's why we say rematriation. Since colonization, the destruction and the value of women has come to a place where we have 231 calls to justice through a huge investigation and a report on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ individuals in our country alone. And which to me, unto itself, the fact that most of our women are not, they're being missing, their murders are not brought into the limelight. There's generally no investigations. We ourselves are touched by this daily. I buried my niece less than a month ago. That shows you how close and how alive this is today, because she went missing and was found murdered in the downtown east side. Right? And so this shows you the devaluation of Indigenous women in this country and the need to consistently hold up spaces for this matriation has to be in every single space through economic reconciliation. And there's multiple ways to do it. And in addition to bringing attention in the document about what rematriation is, I also worked with the Women in Leadership Foundation on an Indigenous leadership project. And I've written a 45-page report just on the topic of Indigenous women and the lack of representation in executive level senior management and board positions in this country, and speak directly to, again, the devaluation of Indigenous women in our workplaces, right? Both in privately held companies and publicly traded companies. And there are multiple reports out there that are stating the same. So this is a personal space, but also the most valuable space, and where we need to really incorporate into the work of what we do when we speak about economic reconciliation, both in the current state and the future state. Am I missing anything?
Next slide, please. So another value that we wanted to highlight is reciprocal relationships. So ones that are built on respect and in the spirit of exchange. Ones that are grounded in principle, the idea that knowledge, capacity, and wisdom is not one-sided or hierarchical, and also recognizing and honoring that each place has its own system of reciprocity to be respected. And that is something that we need to be learning. What is that reciprocal relationship in each place? Is there anything you want to share about this one?
I guess the for me, again, the key word is the reciprocity, right? In this relationship. And when you're approaching from a place of reciprocity, is you understand the value of that relationship and that it's in a space of equality, equity, and inclusion. You are not there to solve the Indian problem. You are not there to share your capacity because you think this is where that project needs to go, or that opportunity needs to be developed. This is this is about being in relationship and right relationship with every single community that you're going to do business with, and honoring the value them as leaders in that space. Because we know where we need to go. We know how to get there. We know what our community needs. And we come from the place of just everything that we shared before this, about who we are and how we are, and the values that we bring in governance and decision-making, in thinking of the 7 generations, and our reciprocity with all living things, with land, place, culture. All of those come into play. So this is about acknowledging that space, respecting that space, but also valuing and using that space alongside the very linear and capitalistic way of seeing development opportunities, or any opportunity in a community. You have to think outside of the box, be uncomfortable with a non-linear space, and be open to the possibilities that we actually can tell you what we need, how we need it, when we need it, and why we need it, for again, the well-being of all things. And this is not a competition. That's what reciprocity is. It's not a competition. It's about not us thriving more than you. It's about the well-being of all of us moving forward together.
Next slide, please. Another value that we wanted to highlight is accountability and truth-telling. So this includes accountability to our children, the land and its creatures, future generations, as well as I'd also add here, to our ancestors and to those who've come before us. It's also about restoring Canada's version of history, and what narratives about how this country came to be and what's happened in this country, how those need to shift. And so this last point of needing narratives based in truth, and showing up with a willingness to reckon with this truth that sheds light on Indigenous peoples' resilience and resurgency. Anything to add there?
I started this work with the knowing that you will be in relationship with us, whether you like it or not. And you either come willingly or you don't. Right. And I mean that with the greatest heart. I don't mean that to be in a negative way or in a down way. But you know, there is value in this truth telling and this accountability in the reciprocal relationships and the rematriation and all of these values and these stepping stones, to come along and be in allyship with this willingly, right? Because at the end of the day, if it's not willingly, then you're going to be in court with us, right? So you'll be forced into a relationship. And who wants to be forced into a relationship? I'm a fan of let's walk this journey together. Let's find solutions together. Let's build something better together, right? And because one, do you want my son? Do I want my nephews? Do I want my niece and nephew over there having these same conversations? Do you want your children in these seats listening to the same thing? I don't. So the time is now to be accountable and responsible, because it's our legacy that we're leaving for them. And I know that that's not a legacy that I want to leave for our children.
Next slide, please. So the other element of the framework that we is the stepping stones. So these are the ongoing practices on a daily basis and basically every aspect of life related to self-reflection, questioning, unlearning, relationship building, and deep listening. So this is a chance to reflect on your sense of self, in what ways you interact with the current system, in what ways you may be benefiting from it, in what ways you're impacted by it, and what do you have within you, and within what resources do you have to be able to change things. It includes learning more about ancestry, relationship to the land you grew up on or are currently living on, and helping to basically instill values into your everyday life, so that you can walk with this accountability that Chief Leanne was just speaking of. I think deep listening relates strongly to this holding space for truth telling, and providing or just showing up with your whole self to be able to listen and take in what it is that needs to be said in a given moment in order for a relationship to deepen or to evolve, basically. And questioning and unlearning, again, this is reckoning with what we've learned about this country's history, and questioning what it is you know and what it is that you don't know, and might need to find out. And then, of course, emphasizing relationship building, as Chief Leanne was just talking about, in terms of rooting it in reciprocity and ensuring that there is like trust, transparency, and patience, and a genuine commitment to relationship building first and foremost. So if we can go to the next slide. So an example just from the framework of some questions around these different practices that we've provided. So in relation to relationship building, to what extent have you practiced empathy, humility, deep listening, and decentering yourself in relationship to Indigenous friends, peers, partners, colleagues, customers, and strangers? How is your relationship being honored? Thinking through like an institutional context or government context, through friendship agreements, Indigenous relations frameworks, ongoing meetings or collaborations. Anything you want to add on that one?
No, and again, a majority of our framework is we're asking you to really do some deep self-reflective through these questions and curiosities. Because when you do that and create the space for that, deep down inside, we already know what the answers are and what the solutions are. It's just a call to action for you to truly reflect, to find that solution, and to be able to commit to that action towards all of these things.
And next slide. So the third part of the framework is this creating ripples. So again, from whichever context you're walking in, there are actions that you can be taking, and those can create impact throughout your community, your region, wherever you are, whatever context you're in. As we keep saying, there's no prescriptive actions for reconciliation, and it really is dependent on the relationships that you're building. But we offer here some different, kind of for different context, some potential questions that might help guide your thinking or your work. So you can go to the next slide, please. So the first part is, again, deeper questions related to our fundamental practices, so the stepping stones. And then the second part, we provide some guiding questions and case examples related to different sectors of economic development. So that includes procurement, finance and management, education, skills building and training, land use and planning, placemaking and design. There's, of course, many other contexts for engaging and interacting with these questions, and it's not at all a kind of compartmentalized piece of work, but we just offer a few context specific series of questions. Next slide, please. So for example, within the procurement section as part of the guidebook, one question to think about is, have you asked Indigenous businesses what barriers they have to bidding? What strategies have you put in place to mitigate these barriers? And then in relation to education, skills building and training, do people see themselves reflected in employment opportunities for them locally? How do you know this? Like, do you engage with people to understand this? And also thinking about resources and how to ensure that resources are being provided for things like childcare, so that learners who are parents are able to attend education, employment programs, skills and training and development. So these are just some questions to help shape how you might approach or think more deeply about relationship building and reconciliation, depending on the context that you're working in. Next slide, please. So the last just couple slides we have are just an opportunity for you to sit with which values are you guided by, or which ones might you have more curiosity about. And next slide. And also within the stepping stones, what is it that you're already practicing, and where might you need to deepen your practice?
Again, this is as much feeling work as it is solutions-based work, as much as it is practical-based work, as much as it is investigative work. Because at the end of the day, offering anything in relationship to an Indigenous community, to a First Nation, to urban Indigenous people, to child and family, to youth, whomever. If you are not in relationship with them, how do you know to actually service and provide programming and funding to them? And this is why we're asking you to be curious about these solutions, and assume you know nothing is basically a good starting point, and that you have to build relationship to find out about what is going to be the possibility in being right relationship and providing those programs and services or funding or whatever it is. Next slide, please. So what's next? Invitations, of course, totally read the whole entire document. My call to action is just don't read the executive summary. Even though that's the more digestible space, because the document is quite extensive. But you'll see when you delve into the document, it's very intentional, it's very purposeful. It's laid out in a very specific way to tell you about what we just shared. Again, so that you're moving from here to here in this work. And digest it in small chunks. Investigate, be curious. If you don't, because this could literally be 4 times longer than it actually is if we were to actually just talk about the truth-telling piece alone, right? About what it is for me to be an Indigenous person in this country today, let alone speak about what it was like for our parents in residential school, what it was like for my husband as a day school survivor, right? Or to what is possible for the future generations. For my son moving through a community that has gone from dependency and scarcity to absolute thriving space in one generation, and what that looks like for him. So again, delve deep, unlearn, be curious, and that can only be done by taking the time to actually commit to this work. Follow my ongoing work. I do a lot of storytelling and share in a lot of different spaces. I'm happy to dialogue, be a part of your journey, ask me questions. If I don't know the answers, we're going to find out together. And I ask you to literally just stay in the river and continue being curious about what this all means. additional resources to check out. The new National Indigenous Economic Development Strategy has been launched this year, a must read for sure. The 92 to 0 Economic Reconciliation Empowers Canada Climate Goals, Economic Reconciliation Supporting a Return to Indigenous Prosperity, and then of course my report on the Women in Leadership Foundation. And I highlight these because these came out after the launch of my document. There is consistently ongoing resources out there for you to use. Grandfather Google knows a lot. Ask him. He is a wealth of information. Again, in the document itself is a ton of resources in there for you to really delve deeper into this work. So I know it's not an easy journey, but if we don't do it, then who will? So next slide. Last but not least, Hoichok, thank you so much. My hands go up to you for sharing this space, being with me this evening, being with us this evening. I do want to honor my co-author, because literally this document would not exist without the beautiful journey we took together to co-write this work, and being able to have a woman be able to take what is in my heart and in my head and the words that I shared, and to literally be able to translate it in a way where a settler Canadian could be with it. Because trying to translate an Indigenous worldview is very difficult for a non-Indigenous settler Canadian to be with and to reckon with in this space. So my hands go up to Lily for creating and this beautiful document with me, because what's laid out in front of you is a beautiful space. So thank you for being here with us. Thank you to everybody that has contributed space for us to do this work and to continue to do this work. So OCM.
Thank you, Sxwpilemaát, and thank you, Lily. We are going to move to the next segment of our evening where we have some respondents who are going to each speak for 5 minutes about how they try to incorporate economic reconciliation into their work or their worldview. And our first person is Marissa Lawrence, and she should be joining us on Zoom any moment. She is Senior Program Officer, First Nation Municipal Community Economic Development Initiative at CANDU. And then we have Ginger Gosnell Myers, and she is Nishkatwak, and she is an Indigenous Fellow in Decolonization and Urban Indigenous Policy and Planning at SFU Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue. Can you use the microphone? Sorry. I sure can. And we also have C. Talkton, Chris Lewis, who will also comment on economic reconciliation. And then after their comments, we'll open it for questions, comments. Okay. Shall we start with Marissa?
Happy to. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll start by just really thanking Chief Leanne and Lily for the invitation to join you tonight. I'm coming to you from Treaty 7. I'm fortunate to live in the territories, which you've all gathered, but I'm also really fortunate to have worked with the First Nation Municipal Partnership over the past couple of days, who are doing some really challenging and really rewarding work together. So as mentioned, I work on the First Nation Municipal Community Economic Development Initiative. We're a national program. Between 2013 and 2021, we worked with 15 partnerships across the country, and we're currently working with 8. We're fortunate to work with all of those partnerships for 3 years. So we support them over the long term to do some really, really deep learning and unlearning, and to build those reciprocal relationships that we've heard the importance of tonight. Our program is really guided by our partnerships. And so while we have a framework that we use, we're constantly learning, adapting, and forming the process, much like the river that Chief Leanne has spoke to there. We're adapting to the communities, to the cultures. I love this question, can we reimagine wealth? What a beautiful invitation for all of us. Because we are a community economic development focused program, we don't really focus on supporting transactional relationships. That's not the business we're in. And in fact, we don't determine success by the number of shovels in the ground as much as our funder, I think, would like us to at certain times. And so, pushing back on that is really important, that we do that really at every level. Right down from funding, pushing back, saying this is not the approach, this is not where we find success, this is not what we're hearing from our partnerships, from the communities who are doing this work. And so I want to say that the relationship between First Nation governments and municipal governments is really one of choice, which makes it a really particular and really incredible opportunity. However, it's not to say these are similar types of government. In fact, they're very different. First Nations, of course, have inherent rights. Municipalities have much smaller jurisdictions and much smaller responsibilities. However, there are opportunities for them to be stronger together. And that can look like reducing the duplication of services, reducing infrastructure, to increase economic opportunities within the territories in the region for all peoples. And to improve the environment and to ensure the well-being of all peoples. And so I'm wanting to reflect really on the framework, and I'm really thinking deeply, specifically about what was just shared about the reciprocal relationships. It's foundational to a successful partnership. When the knowledge exchange is respectful and reciprocal, we have incredible opportunities to reimagine wealth. And I want to share a few examples of partnerships that I have worked with and I'm currently working with. And this looks like a lot of different, this looks very different in every community. Again, as we've heard, there's no two ways to do this that is going to be the same. Every community, every First Nation will guide us in a different way. So I'm thinking about today, we were talking about level of commitment, and it was, we were reminded by a counselor, First Nation counselor, that said, we gathered back in March when we kicked off this partnership to really set the intention, and we engaged, we shared a pipe ceremony together. There is no terms of reference or MOU that will ever compete with that ceremony. Nothing will be more meaningful. And I invite all of us to really reflect on what that means, the privilege for us as a program to be involved in that, but also, of course, the municipality to be invited into such a sacred space. I think about next week, I'm headed to Treaty 2 territory where we're going to spend, the nation has decided that they'd like to host us and the municipality out on the land, finding the bison and learning together with and from that experience. What an incredible opportunity for all of us. And I think about, a partnership back during the pandemic. When we gathered back in, say, February 2020, that partnership had a joint strategic plan, and they had very specific shared goals. And then the pandemic hit. And when we came back to that shared table in May 2020, we saw change, we saw a shift. We saw that priorities had shifted. We saw that the municipality was in response to the province reopening and businesses reopening, and the nation's attention stayed right where it needed to, at home, looking at the well-being of their community, really understanding the wealth of keeping their community well, keeping their elders and knowledge keepers and moms well. And so I want to sort of say that and close my comments there. I can't express to you enough the gift that we are offered in reciprocal relationship, when we can find different ways to see this world around us that isn't working. And I invite all of us to really step into that beautiful question, how do we reimagine wealth? So I thank you so much, Chief Leanne and Lily, for your work on this. It will be a foundational document for many of us, and I see it reflected in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. It's true and it's lived, and I'm very grateful for it. So thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. That was excellent. Okay, can we also hear from Ginger?
Sure. Hey. Great. Thank you both for providing such a really strong narrative on the type of economy that we need to see. What really resonates with me is that I do bring this into my work quite a bit already. And I think it's this intuition that we have as Indigenous peoples who are centered in our community, who just want to do things in the way that would make our ancestors proud and our community members proud. And for those of us who are rooted in protocol and understand ceremonies and want to give respect to that, like there is a way of being and doing. And so I feel like you've given voice to that way of being and doing that feels intuitive in a lot of senses. And so, you know, as Marissa had said, you know, a lot of the values that are outlined, I bring into my work as an urban planner already. And I wanted to share some of the context that really resonated for me. When I think about reimagining wealth, I absolutely think that we need to move away from a human-centered lens when it comes to the type of economy that we value and prioritize. You know, I am at the SFU Center for Dialogue. In the last semester that I taught last year, our topic was Semester by the Salish Sea. And one of the student projects that came out of the Semester by the Salish Sea was, what if we looked at urbanism through an ocean-centered lens, as opposed to a human-centered lens? And so, you know, this for me comes back to how we need to move away from human-centered lenses and priorities if we're going to survive through the climate emergency that we're in the super warm September that we're in, and the fact that Pakistan has been underwater, the fact that we just suffered, you know, these catastrophic hurricanes on the East Coast, and of course the heat dome last year. There's a lot of motivation that we should all have to changing our economic values into something that is more of a well-being economy. And so that really resonated with me as well. When I look at urbanism and city planning, the conversations that I had when I first started out were taken in an off-putting way, in that things I said came across as a little weird. Like, oh, Ginger, we can't do that. That's, you know, that's breaking the rules, or that's giving, you know, special treatment to, you know, Indigenous peoples or Indigenous rights. And I think, you know, what you're outlining is that we really do need to be intentional about what we do in our own organizations. And this is what I'm thinking about here. I think I'm not thinking about the economy overall. I'm thinking about, you know, what I can do in my work right now. And a lot of that is breaking our own rules, you know, moving away from the things that we hold dear, that make our organizations run smoothly, or perhaps give, you know, power or privilege to certain folks. I think providing special treatment to other groups and other aspects will change things up enough that we can start to see the type of change that we need, so that we can start to see a bit of a well-being economy. It also opens up the opportunity for something that you talked about earlier, which was co-creation. This is something that I do quite a bit in urban planning. We know we're in the midst of a municipal election right now. I know this because I moderated an all candidates forum just downstairs yesterday, and a lot was said in the context of centering equity. And we know when it comes to city building, there was so much ableism brought into planning our streets, planning our buildings, how people with disabilities are often left out of traveling from A to B, or living safely in a home that they can feel provides the type of space that is needed. I think for those of you with children, it's not a great place to raise children all of the time. What if we created cities that centered children? It would look so much more different. And so these are the questions that I bring into the work that I do, because they weren't discussed before, right? And so when you talk about the importance of rematriating decision-making, For me, I think about how it wasn't that long ago that the majority of voices that we heard that were Indigenous in this country were from male chiefs. You know, we have 633 First Nations across this country, and primarily we heard from the Assembly of First Nations, and they're primarily all male chiefs. And so, you know, we want to open up, you know, the discourse for a variety of voices, because we bring this well-being economy, this community lens into our efforts. We're moving away from making money, and we're moving towards how do we take care of each other. And when I think about urban planning, it is very much about how do we create cities that support all of our aspirations and all of our well-beings, because cities are places of economic growth. They showcase the power that we are as a modern society. And a lot of people are still left out of that. And they're left out because a lot of the questions that you brought up are not raised when we're having these conversations about what do we need to do versus what are the things that we need to give up. And let's break our own rules along the way. Finally, I have a lot to say, but you know, we're going to go into a panel discussion. On an overarching level, you know, the thing that I think about is how we have more educated Indigenous peoples today than ever before. You know, Simon Fraser University has a really successful MBA program, and we have, you know, probably thousands of Indigenous people with MBAs across this country right now. And for organizations that are looking to increase their role in economic reconciliation, I say hire all of these incredible people. I actually don't see it in the city, right? We have all of these Coast Salish individuals with MBAs, and I don't see any of them running any organizations anywhere. That means that the majority of the businesses in the city and this country are failing by not creating space for this Indigenous leadership who have jumped through all of the hoops in order to be at a certain level that matches the type of job that needs to be filled. And when organizations do tend to hire an Indigenous person, they tend to hire one Indigenous person. And my husband, Troy, who some of you know, he coined this term called the magic Indian. And yeah, we're laughing because when organizations will hire one Indigenous person and they expect them to be everything. You know, we want you to, lobby the Prime Minister, and we want you to build relationships with 12 local First Nations, and we want you to bring in young people so that we can mentor them, and we want you to create a framework, and we want you to provide cultural competency training for, you know, our 10,000 staff, and we want you to read, you know, like all of our budget line items. And this is seriously, you know, the job description for a lot of Indigenous peoples who are brought into some of these roles. And so teams really matter. The thing that struck me is how we need to provide this community in order to provide the type of thoughts that we need for the type of economy that we need that will drive us out of the climate emergency that we're in. Because for me, that's what I'm focused on right now. I think so many of us are. Things need to change now if we're going to meet our targets in the next 10 years. 10 years ago, I created the City of Reconciliation framework here in the city of Vancouver. I brought in a lot of the values and principles that you speak about in Step Into the River, and we see the changes throughout the city of Vancouver right now. We know much more about the lands that we're on, Kamkamali, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh unceded homelands. We know much more about the duty of protocol and respect. What can we do now to ensure that we are much more informed and prepared 10 years from now? And I hope that organizations and businesses really heed the framework that you've outlined to bring a lot of this reciprocity, rematriation, co-creating, and a well-being economy in, because it's the change that we need. So thank you.
Fascinating. Sitoktin.
Just want to thank Ginger. I forgot my wand, Magic Indian. I love that. And I was chuckling when I heard that because sometimes I say we're looking for unicorns, they don't exist. When we're trying to create an Indigenous position. I'm like, you want it, then I'm like, those are unicorns. And I was like, they don't exist. So we need to kind of create multiple. Sxwpilemaát, just really want to thank you for the presentation and basing us in culture. And I think about the stepping into the river, and throughout the whole presentation, I had my own metaphor going on in my head of one of the first times I went down rapids with my grandfather in an old dugout flat bottom canoe on the Squamish River, whitewater rapids, full of chum salmon, hitting the bottom. And he told me, we're going to hit the bottom, so don't freak out. Just hold on to the raft like raptors. And the water was coming in, the fish were going out. I was trying to grab the fish and he was yelling at me, don't grab the fish, just let him go. Right. And it's this notion of, and I think about that all the time as a metaphor because he was teaching me how to control the fear. The wealth was in the canoe, the fish were in the canoe, and the wealth is going to go out, the water's going to come in, but you'll be okay at the end of the river. So I was thinking about that as we got embarked upon this journey. And I think about this notion of wealth from an Indigenous perspective. And the work that I do is I've been taught as an Indigenous Squamish person that wealth to us is not about what's in your wallet or in your bank account, but how much you give away. And we have potlatch systems and ceremonies that showcase that, and hence why it was banned as the Indian Act, because they looked and they said, why are these chiefs giving everything they own away to everybody else? It's about the redistribution of wealth, and not one person in the village or the community or communities or nations, whoever comes, goes without. And I think that rethinking of that from a community perspective, as all of us here, I think would help. And I think about the notion of kinship, and Chief Leanne started there. She talked about who she was and where she comes from. Kinship is really your access to resources and to wealth from an Indigenous perspective. And we call it a Siyām. So she talked about her kinship to Turquoise, which is known as Gibson's now on the Sunshine Coast. Like that's where her chieftainship comes from. And she has a Siyām, which means she has a responsibility. In a colonial way, we would think she owns it and all that kind of stuff, but it's a responsibility to pass it on in a better state than she received it. So if you think about that from a climate change perspective and all of that, if we start thinking about that accountability as human beings to our future generations around how we do that. So I think about that in terms of the work that I do. And I think Chief Leanne asked me to come and speak because I was a founding member of the MST Development Corporation, was in the rooms and when we were having those tough conversations. And I was also a founding member of the Inchikai Development Corporation, which we all saw the Prime Minister a few weeks ago announcing kind of $1 billion loan from CMHC for a Squamish Nation project in Sanok. Now, all of that stuff doesn't happen overnight. You got to get in the river, you got to get in the canoe and base yourself in culture. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And like Ginger, I can talk all night and probably do my own presentation, but I won't. In terms of ceremony, and I just want to kind of base what we heard here into actual practice in terms of and I was writing my notes down. The reason we formed MST DC Development Corporation, and we're the largest landowner and the largest real estate developer now in the city. We're a city builder. We have 90 acres at Jericho and everybody's freaking out because we're redeveloping it and all of that. But how we got there was we went into the longhouse over in Musqueam. And we put all of the politics aside and our egos aside, and we left them at the door and we went into ceremony. That's what got us to the protocol that we all see today. It was also the kinship ties where there was a young child that passed away that was connected to Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, had kinship to all three. The funeral was in Musqueam, and there was more Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people there than Musqueam people. And as leaders, and I remember I was there, I was at that funeral, we said, what are we doing? We're connected, we're family. And this child kind of brought us together and reminded us of that. because the Indian Act has taught us very well on how to fight one another. And we had to unlearn the Indian Act and unlearn kind of those things around governments telling us what to do. And we were very good at it. We were very good at choking each other out. And we lost economic opportunities as a result of that. Or we were in court with one another and there'd be one winner and two losers, or nobody would win. So I think I base it back into ceremony. And I think about that kinship. And we talked about, traditionally, we would fight off raiders that would come to this land. So we would combine and we would fight people off. In more recent times, we formed an alliance to fight government around land claims and all of those types of things in the 1920s, and we stayed together. That resulted in us getting taxation rights and taking something away from municipalities, which led to the dualistic kind of fight between municipalities, which I'll get to. We joined forces around shared lands, and we said we're going to fight government together, and we're going to do this because we're better together. And 1/3 of something is better than 100% of nothing. And I remember saying that to my community, but we had to go back to our community and talk a little bit about this. And we had to base it in kinship, or our elders wouldn't understand. This notion around how to get from this current state to a future state. I sit on the Investment Vancouver board with Metro Vancouver, and we got a report from Deloitte. I think it was Deloitte. But they talked about our whole mandate of that board is to increase investment into the region, foreign and internal and domestic. One of the big things was reconciliation was actually seen as a risk, because the world just watched the nations fight Trans Mountain. They watched the power of the nation stop major projects. So why would the world invest into this region when they said these indigenous peoples, you don't have, there's no certainty around there. And I think that's real. And I think around attracting investment into our region, around unlocking economic wealth, not only for indigenous peoples, but all of us in this area. So when we think about reimagining in wealth and kind of moving forward, it is about those relationships. And it's about that need to unlearn those colonial concept of wealth. And I love the notion of rematriation and upholding our women and putting them in their rightful place. If you go to a ceremony, especially Coast Salish, we call them kind of floor managers now. The speaker will be speaking, but there'll be a lady that holds all the rules in the agenda in her head and tells the man kind of where to go and what are the steps. And so when you think about that and you think about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and the concept of that, where you have, I think I heard something today where an Indigenous woman is 4 times more likely to get murdered than just a non-Indigenous Canadian girl, and 10 times more likely to get abducted. And so the thing is that protection of our woman is super important, because if you think about it from a traditional perspective, the woman would hold the rights, they would hold the customs, they would hold the language, and all of the knowledge that they would pass down to their children. Now, if you take them out of that situation, the economy starts to crumble. And all of that aspect around that teaching and in relations to it. And also our economies were based on kinship. So I remember talking to Chief Stephen Point. We were at a shared territories conference around how can First Nations work together around shared territories and overlaps. We were talking, and he was the keynote speaker, and he kind of said, when I wanted access to resources in a different place, he goes, I would go and arrange a marriage. It would be a woman, it would be one of my kids that I would arrange a marriage so that there was kinship ties there. So I could always go there and I was always in peace. And so there was ways that we did it. And it's interesting because when I apply that to MST, we did the same thing, but it was already established. We just needed to unlearn and remember that we were connected. So I think about women being the pathways to our success and wealth, and that notion of reciprocity in relations to solving our issues. So I'll use Sanok as an example because it was in the paper. There's going to be 10,000 people living there. It's going to be 6,000 units, 11 towers on 10 acres of land. There's not enough Indigenous peoples in our communities to fill that space. So it's going to be non-Indigenous people that are going to live there and rent there and do and all of that. So we're creating a different space in how we do that. And we're solving the house. We're providing a solution to the housing crisis. We're providing more access to rental and housing and all of that aspect. And I can apply that to MST as well in terms of how we work with cities. So it's that notion of reciprocity and ensuring that we move forward and that there's a ripple effect. And we talk about procurement, removing those barriers for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and there's many. You think of, and I used to battle BC Hydro in my previous life quite good. It was one of my upbringings. My aunties told me, you shall not like BC Hydro because they did this. And I would go into the BC Hydro meeting and say, it's not your fault. I've been taught that I should not like you. But the thing is we try to remove the systematic barriers on projects that were in our territory. And it took some time, but we kind of got there because they were willing to step back and kind of say, we need to change our process. And then education, skills, and training. One of the things that keep me up at night as a former counselor, and I served 12 years on our Squamish Nation Council, is we have all of these opportunities that I just mentioned. And I want to ensure that when it's all done, our communities look back from the 3 host nations or just Squamish in relations to Sanok and say, we built that. No one else built it, we did. That means our people need to be in those buildings, if it's in the trades or if it's in the offices, doing all of that stuff. And we need to be intentional in terms of doing that. And that's where SFU and other institutions come in, and MBAs, like the MBA should be hired so that they're running things and doing all of those things. So it's just those types of things that I think we need to do around that deep listening. And then in ceremony, we do deep listening. We're not allowed to talk. Like, you're not allowed to disrupt the ceremony, or the aunties will look at you. What are you doing? Be quiet and all of that. But it's also a reflection on yourself that you're being disrespectful to the work, and we wouldn't do that. So I think about how we unlearn the Indian Act and the legislative oppression and all of that. And I'll end here. Municipal relations, in my view, is the current battleground and one of the last battlegrounds around reconciliation. Because we have a problem around land use and service agreements, especially in this region. For so long, municipalities have held the lever around land use and First Nations reserves and not providing adequate services to those places to unlock economic potential of reserves. That's through service agreements, if it's water and sewer, and we can see it with Tsawwassen. Tsawwassen signed a treaty and they still couldn't get water and sewer from adjoining municipalities. They had to build their own infrastructure because the adjoining municipalities wouldn't provide it to them. And this is in recent times. So, and so I think this notion of infrastructure and unlocking the economic wealth gets back to Chief Leanne and the presentation we saw, is that we need the courage to get into the canoe that's full of fish and opportunities in this. We're going to hit the ground, we're going to hit the rocks. I think I was probably screaming, I wasn't that old. But we're going to lose some things, we're going to gain water, but we're going to get through the rapids. Thank you very much.
Hey, we have time now for questions, and I would like to invite the panel members, if you would like, to come sit up at the table. Chief Leanne and Lily, can you also come on up to the front? And we also have some people online as well. But let's start off with a question from the live audience. Anyone here like to start out? Yes, please.
Hi, so I have a question when it comes to engaging Indigenous communities. We know that relationship matters and economic development matters. So when you think about the larger projects, it's often you can get the attention of the community, you can get their time with small projects and small things that you can do with your purchase card, or you don't have to actually go out to bid. You can just go spend that money without question. There's a lot of communities across the province that aren't very large, and they are being approached by everybody and their mother. And they're also working on creating their own child welfare legislation. They have so many competing priorities. How do you go and navigate that? So one of the things is, of course, you should be paying for the time of these Indigenous communities to engage them, but sometimes they just don't even have the people. So how do you go and navigate those situations, and how would you suggest that? And particularly when oftentimes at a provincial level and a federal level, you have budgets that are approved on a yearly basis. So if you don't spend that money or you don't get it out your door by X date, it's kind of lost.
Great question. I don't think there is a solution to the undercapacity in First Nation communities. A lot of it is just going to require patience and understanding that that opportunity may need to pass by until you can work together with the community to either building that capacity, supporting space, in addition to developing that capacity, and then thinking again in those potentially the medium or longer terms to move towards that, right? Because you're right, there are many rural remote communities where there is generally each person is probably doing 2 or 3 roles within the organization. Because unlike municipalities or corporations or nonprofits, we are both federal government, provincial government, municipality, health services, education, housing, you name it. We are everything in a community. We are managing all of those things all at one time. And even our nation struggles to hold the capacity to run and manage all of those things. And we're a very large, wealthy nation. So I don't know if you guys have a different answer to this question. Ginger?
I do. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. You can do your homework in advance if you haven't. So I think we assume that engagement with First Nations is about sitting across from a First Nation to talk about your project and how you want them to be involved. And you want to find where the alignment is, right? And First Nations are probably hearing about your project for the first time. You know, they're wondering where the alignment is. They're checking their clock. They got like a 10 o'clock appointment that they have to run to. Plus, you know, they have to manage a funeral, you know, later on that afternoon. So, you know, their priorities are definitely in a million different places. So how can you catch their attention? Well, you can catch their attention by doing your homework in advance. Most First Nations have their strategic priorities or their land use plans already available online. So how does your project align with those land use priorities or their priorities for their own community well-being or for how they want to see wealth created? This is not, you know, out there in the abyss. You can Google it and identify those alignments yourself, so that when you finally are able to sit across from a First Nation or reach somebody on the phone or by email, they can recognize themselves in your project, and you're not building that relationship from scratch. And that is meaningful, and that will catch their attention. It would catch my attention. And I'd be more willing to ignore the email or the phone call or the meeting request if it's apparent that you're connecting with me from scratch. I'm not going to do that type of from scratch work with you. I just don't have time. You can find this information though, and you should, because you'll learn a lot more in the process.
I think also too is dismantling and thinking again in a very linear way of we have to do it your way. You're expected us to fit into your box. And we can shift how we think about funding. We can shift policies around how funding is laid out. And dismantle a colonized way and a very linear way of thinking about how we see project development, project management, project funding, program funding. So in addition to that space, we also have to look at how do we decolonize those spaces, because you do know that there is competing priorities within the community, but you still expect us to try and meet you where you're at in your project or program or service delivery, again, in your way. And in my framework, I'm asking you to be super reflective about how can you shift that. And that's long-term work, right? And how do you get those Indigenous voices by doing your homework at the table to not only engage in a specific project or program or service delivery space, but then also what is the medium and long-term goals of dismantling those spaces as well. So there's a multitude of complexities in moving towards getting communities involved in very different ways.
Thank you. Someone else? Do we have an online question, Lori? No, okay, someone else. Sean.
Chief Leanne, there was a moment where you were talking about the production of the document with Lily and how the partnership allowed you to translate your worldview onto the page. And that for me is what, I didn't realize it when I was reading it, but that for me is what really stood out for the piece. It's an extraordinarily brave piece of work. It's deeply meaningful because it's very personal, and that translation I think comes through. It's essentially an impossible task to try to get someone else to understand a different worldview. But the document is, I think, a beautiful manifestation of trying to do that, of really trying to serve the purpose of reconciliation by bridging an understanding of what a different worldview could be or can be. I'm just wondering if you have any other thoughts around how you are leveraging this document in your work with other people, with companies or with businesses, because it's a deeper step and involves all of the, I think, the hard personal work that the document also asks people to do. So anyway, just further reflections on that would be wonderful to hear.
And for me, it's challenging, I think, personally, to land in one place of where is that deeper space? You know, I've asked a lot of self-reflection. I've asked a lot of curiosity, and a lot of calls to action also. I mean, my biggest struggle in writing the framework was my call to action was just exactly what we just talked about. I am asking almost every single Canadian to go to their local First Nation, build a relationship, try to look at economic development, economic reconciliation, education, unlearning, questioning. Like, that's a lot of demand. And I struggle with what space do I then hold moving forward? Am I now need to step into a space of supporting Indigenous peoples, communities, nations, in answering and building these relationships and creating this reciprocity, decolonizing the mindset around an Indian Act way of thinking from dependency and scarcity into thriving, to answer these calls to action. When so much of the constant demand is from settler Canadians of, well, how do I deepen this? Can you answer these questions? I need to learn more. Can you tell me about this? And I think I'll go back to Ginger's call to action is do your homework. I'm not responsible for your reconciliation. None of us are responsible for your reconciliation, right? There is enough out there because we've been working on reconciliation basically since, well, prior to 1986, since contact, we have constantly asked for title rights, reconciliation, equity, inclusion. All of these spaces have been asked for since settlers have come to this country. But the call today is be accountable, be responsible for that aspect of your journey in learning and unlearning. And again, I'm still in that battle internally of where to next and how do we take this deeper. And literally, the short answer is I'm still in a place of curiosity, I guess. It has raised more questions than it has provided me. Do I actually need to go deeper, or do I need to continue to explore and answer some of these questions that continue to come about as a result of just writing the framework itself, right? So I know that doesn't answer your question, but it's a space that I think we all need to be curious about. What does this mean then? How do we move through this space? What does it look like? And and rather than for me to just continue to hold this space, it's not for me to hold, right? Wholly. It is our responsibility every single day in our lives, both personally and professionally, to hold that space, right? And then that way the onus is not on just Indigenous peoples or just on settlers. It's about what we can do daily at the end of the day. And again, it is done in very minute ways that creates the ripples towards the possibility of where we can move towards. So that's the best I could offer. Sorry.
I have a question for Leanne and Chris. Okay, I have a question and then I have to leave because I have to jump on the C bus before it changes to every 30 minutes, right? So my question for Chief Leanne and Chris. So, I mean, how would this apply to the Squamish Nation in all of the economic development opportunities that are underway right now in terms of like the future state, right? I think there are a lot of things that are happening right now, a lot of things that can be done better, and a lot of potential for growth too. So, you know, at the nation level, what does this look like for you?
I'm gonna defer to Chris first. I have some ideas, but I want to hear Chris first.
Yeah, thanks, Ginger. I thought we were going to have that conversation on the C bus. No, I think, you know, with the economic opportunity with the host nations, and I guess in particular Squamish, is that we need to be intentional on creating economic leaders, if it's CEOs, if it's architects, to occupy the field in relations to that, land use planners, in that embody our culture and our traditions into what we're doing and what we're building. Because what happens if we don't do that, we then just become passive in relations to the opportunity. We solve some problems in the short term and all of that, but what we want to do is get back to that notion of redistribution of wealth. Because, and what the scary thing is that, you know, say we make billions of dollars over the next 100 years, which is contemplated. But if your community is unhealthy and you're giving money into a community that's unhealthy and that hasn't healed, it perpetuates the unhealthiness. So, and I think that's the work that we have to do, is we have to empower our communities so that we know what to do with wealth and we know what to do with the education. And what that does is that, and I think the work internally we need to do is around the notion of roles, is get back to that traditional economy in a modern context and adapt it. Maybe you're not a canoe builder anymore, but you're an architect, something of that nature. Maybe you're not an artist, you're something else in a modern context. But we need to be purposeful in terms of looking at the kids that are in school right now and the community members that we have, and kind of like we did in the past, look at their attributes, because we did it in the past. We would kind of say they have artistic kind of attributes, so they're going to be a canoe builder or an artist. And we didn't shy away from that as Indigenous people. We said, this is what you're going to do. And I think we need to get back to that and be a little bit more purposeful and kind of say, this is because if we don't occupy the field, and then we miss the opportunity other than just the economic opportunity, if you know what I mean. So that's kind of where my mind's at. Thank you.
Yeah, it's along the same lines. In thinking about, again, what is wealth and what are we valuing communities? So my beautiful, amazing human being of a son is, has Western labels of being ADHD, has all forms of dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, has slow processing challenges, has all of these labels in this education system. But he's brilliant. He's gifted. He's spiritually connected, and brings amazing gifts into this world because he is absolutely destined for greatness, because that's why he chose to come here, right? As a spiritual being, wanting a human experience. And how I cultivate that is by allowing him to be in that giftedness, to hone those skills, and not solely force them into a system that only values the production of what they want, right? So I am going to raise a child that is going to be a spiritual person in our community. He's going to be the one telling you what the trees are saying to us, right? I mean, settler Canadians talk about having voice for those that don't have voices, right? Where we come from, they have voices, you're just not listening, right? And these gifted children, gifted individuals have the ability to listen, have the ability to communicate and understand, again, the reciprocity of that listening and relationship with all living things. So how do we cultivate all of these beautiful gifts that you have come into the world with and not put them into a box? How do we allow them to thrive? And it's very true. We have come from a space where we are first children removed from residential schools and day schools, right? Our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents went to residential schools, day schools, or 60 scoop survivors, you name it, right? And we are the first ones to be able to go to post-secondary schools, right? Our parents weren't allowed to do that. The Indian Act did not allow that to happen. We are a generation that was allowed to vote freely in every single election, right? So there's numerous spaces where we have to decolonize ourselves, decolonize our minds, decolonize our spaces as well. And we have a lot of healing to do internally. We have a lot of nation to nation building to do as well. But that is our responsibility to do that. And we are doing that because our children are demanding it of us. because they are witnessing what we are doing. Right? My son's greatness comes from the witness of what legacies have been left for him and the greatness that is supported to be able to do and achieve what he is. Thank you,
Thank you,
Ginger, so
Ginger.
much. And yeah, and we don't do it alone. This document wasn't written, right, because of just what I needed to translate. I let the creator speak through me. I allow my ancestors to speak through me. I let the people yet to be to speak through me, right? And that's the voice that has come out. That's what you have heard. And if we continue to allow that spaces and we think of how we do things differently, it's going to create the greatness that is going to be required to meet the modern spaces, but also with the knowledge of who we are and where we came from and why we're here. So that we're going to constantly create that balance needed for our own well-being. Sxwpilemaát.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Chris, thank you so much. And Lily, especially Chief Sxwpilemaát, and Marissa, thank you for joining us. We're gonna have to close now, but I hope that we all have more courage to step into the river. There's a lot to be discovered. Thank you.
It's an honor to be in space with you today. It's an honor to share some of these teachings and these voices, and I appreciate your time, effort, and energy to listen and to share space with me. And I look forward to traveling this journey with you moving forward. So, Sxwpilemaát.